Hello again. For this video, I want to talk about Mother Tongue by Amy Tan, which I believe I gave you for homework last week, for week 2 homework. I think there was a journal for it that was due this Monday, that was due on the 4th. So I want to get into this essay. All right, so she begins by talking about the different kinds of English that we use. She uses this phrase, the different Englishes that we all speak. I think that's a really good phrase. I think that's on the second page. But on the first page, she talks about like an experience that made her realize this, and then all the stuff she gets into about the way that her mother talks and all that stuff. And she describes an experience when she was giving a speech, right? Amy Tan is an author. I remember I had to read some of her stories when I was in grade school. I don't know if they still use them. But she's a fiction writer. She has a famous book of short stories, all that. So she's giving some kind of talk about the book of short stories that she wrote. And I'm just going to read some here from page 127 from the first page, the third paragraph. She says, "The talk was going well enough until I remembered one major difference that made the whole talk sound wrong. My mother was in the room, and it was perhaps the first time she had heard me give a lengthy speech using the kind of English I have never used with her. I was saying things like the intersection of memory upon imagination, and there is an aspect of my fiction that relates to thus and thus. A speech filled with carefully wrought grammatical phrases, burdened, it suddenly seemed to me, with nominalized forms, past perfect tenses, conditional phrases, all the forms of standard English that I had learned in school and through books, the forms of English I did not use at home with my mother." So I feel like one of the things that this essay does is it kind of starts with her in a place where she's into the standard English, right? She's giving a fancy speech that she probably got paid for, right? And she wants to use standard English to sound super professional and all that. But her mother is in the room, and we'll get into the way that she's talked with her mother before. Her mother, I think, was a Chinese immigrant. I think her mother was actually born in China, right? And then Amy Tan, I think, was born in America. Um, so yeah, she talks about how having her mother there, and she's using all this, overly fancy standard English. She suddenly feels like it's wrong. So I feel like this essay is kind of her realizing the value of the dialect that she grew up with, and coming to respect the way that her mother talks, and maybe almost even she ends up preferring that, preferring the sort of dialect her mother uses to this kind of, overly fancy, I guess, standard English. So after that example, she gives another example. She says, "Just last week, I was walking down the street with my mother, and I again found myself conscious of the English I was using and the English I use with her. We were talking about the price of new and used furniture, and I heard myself saying this: not waste money that way." So yeah, you can feel like the dialect there, right? She goes on to say that this kind of talking more in her mother's dialect. She says now on the second page, 128, at the bottom of the first paragraph. She says, "It has become our language of intimacy, a different sort of English that relates to family talk, the language I grew up with." So I think this is where I see, so for this essay, I see it connecting to the topic that I gave you, that was language and culture. The way that we talk connects us to our culture or our family or our traditions, or even makes us part of like a certain group. Like people who like I think I said before, I think there's a dialect that people who are into video games use. There's a dialect that people who are into sports use. So that's the topic from our narrative essay assignment sheet that I see showing up in this essay. And yeah, she talks about how, so she was still speaking English with her mom, right? It's not like they were just speaking in Chinese, and that's the language she associates with her mom. It's a sort of, we're going to break down this phrase in a little bit, but it's a sort of broken English, right? A sort of dialect of English, though. And she says this is the language of intimacy, a different sort of English that relates to family, the language I grew up with. So just to give you guys an example, my family is Italian. My parents are the North Jersey Italians. So there are certain words, like especially around food, there are certain words that I definitely associate with my parents specifically, and I guess more generally with like the culture. So for instance, like my mom especially, instead of saying mozzarella, she'll say mozzarella. Or if you guys know the Italian food manicotti, it's like a kind of lasagna type dish with sauce and I think cheese. But yeah, people call it manicotti. She calls it manigot, right? Or um, the red stuff that you put on pasta. It's either red sauce if it's marinara, which again she wouldn't say marinara, she would say marina. It's either red sauce if there's no meat in it, or it's gravy if there is meat in it, right? Or another one, if you guys know ricotta cheese, my mom will say ricotta, right? And these things, they're not even really Italian pronunciations. They're like specifically Italian Americans. Because, I remember when I took Italian in high school, and I learned that like there's not any silent vowels in Italian. If ricotta is RCOTTA, and there's no reason you'd pronounce it rigot. Like there's no silent A in Italian. That's not an Italian thing. It's an Italian American thing, right? So that's just an example, from my background of, and living in North Jersey. If I go into, an Italian bakery and they're like, oh, you want the mozzarella? Like, I know immediately it's like, oh, this person kind of is of the same culture, or like belongs to like the same kind of group that I do, just based on the way that they talk. I remember like having friends come over to my house for dinner in high school, and they would be like, "Oh, is this marinara?" And my mom's like, "Oh, it's marina." So again, just to give an example, it's still English, right? It's not like speaking a different language necessarily. Although I think that could work for an essay like this too, if you did want to do something about whatever, speaking a different language at home. But it's the different kinds of English, the different Englishes that we use. And I think the way that so back to our question of why is language important, I think this shows us a reason that language is important, because language is one of the biggest parts of culture. When we think about culture, we think about probably food, we think about the way you dress maybe, and then language is like the next one. So even if we're all speaking English, there's still different ones. Like I remember I had a friend who lives in Indiana, and out there, and instead of saying soda, they say pop. Or I remember I was in Indiana, and we were with my friend who I was visiting and some of his friends, and we were gonna get pizza, and there was like 3 or 4 of us, and I was like, so what should we get, like 2 pies? And they're like, we're not getting pie. Like they don't call it a pizza pie, they just like call it a pizza, and I guess they mean a whole pie. I think it's because they don't do slices. I think they don't sell pizza by the slice in some places in the Midwest. But whatever, you get what I mean. It's like different ways that we talk that connect us to a certain background or a certain culture. So I think that's what she's talking about here. Okay, let's get into some of the other stuff that she says. Still on the second page on 128, at the second to last paragraph at the bottom, talking about the way that her mother speaks. She writes, that was the language that helped shape the way I saw things, expressed things, made sense of the world. So she's saying here how the language that we kind of absorb from our families, like from the time that we're born, kind of affects how we understand the world. Because, our thoughts, what are our thoughts? They're all language. All we can do is think in terms of language and words and stuff. So we understand the world around us, through language in this way. So if you grew up with a different sort of English, that can, you think about things or see things differently. Is kind of what she's talking about there. So another thing that she talks about, okay, let's get into the broken English thing now. So that's kind of the positive. I've said for a lot of these, there's a positive side, there's a negative side. So the positive side here is the way that the dialect connects her to her family and her culture and all that. The negative side is what she gets into at the bottom of page 128, when she talks about how she has described her mother's language before as broken or fractured English. And then she goes on to kind of think about it, and she goes, she says, it has always bothered me that I can think of no other way to describe it than broken, as if it were damaged and needed to be fixed. So she starts to look at this idea of that it's broken English and like be like, oh, wait a minute, that's like kind of fucked up to look at it that way, Because she's starting to have a more positive view of the dialect that her mother speaks in. And it is pretty extreme when you think about it, broken English. as if like the way that you talk is like shattering the entire language. It's like if it's the people like moving like a glass window across the street and somebody crashes through it. Yeah, that's what you're doing to the English language. It's pretty messed up, right? The only other thing I can think about that we talk about that way is breaking the law. Your actions have shattered the entire legal system. It's blown up because of because you jaywalked or whatever. You were smoking in the woods as a kid, and now the entire law has broken beneath you. It's a very extreme way of talking about it, I think, and I think it reflects the kind of judgment and the kind of discrimination that people who speak in a dialect can face, right? And that's kind of the negative side here. It's similar to like what Vershawn Young was talking about in that essay when he talks about the kind of unfair treatment that people get for not speaking the standard English. So she says here on page 129, she says, because when I was growing up, my mother's limited English limited my perception of her. I was ashamed of her English. I believe that her English reflected the quality of what she had to say. That is, because she expressed them imperfectly, her thoughts were imperfect. And I had plenty of evidence to support me. The fact that people in department stores, at banks, and at restaurants did not take her seriously, did not give her good service, pretended not to understand her, or even acted as if they did not hear her. So I think here she gets into the negative side of the way that people get treated unfairly for speaking this dialect. So it's a positive because of the way it connects us back to our culture and traditions and roots, and it makes us feel like we're part of a community. But it also has this negative side of being kind of judged for it, of like we talked about with the other essay, of maybe not getting a job at the job interview because of something like that. So she gives a few other examples here. She gives this example where she's like kind of translating on the phone for her mom. When her mom is like trying to call her stockbroker, and she makes teenage Amy Tan talk on the phone. How old was she? It tells us how old she was. I think she was like 13 or something. And she makes her talk on the phone because Amy was better at speaking the standard English because she was going to school every day and like getting the standard English, like learning it better and getting practice with it and everything. So she talks about that experience as I think that relates to I think it relates to the kind of unfair treatment thing because her mother seemingly knows that if she just got on the phone and talked to the stockbroker, that she wouldn't be taken seriously. She'd be dismissed. They wouldn't actually try to help her. And that's what happens in the next example she gives when her mother's at the hospital, right? So I'll just read from some of the bottom of page 129. She says, my mother had gone to the hospital for an appointment to find out about a benign brain tumor a CAT scan had revealed a month ago. She said she had spoken very good English, her best English, no mistakes. Still, she said, the hospital did not apologize when they said they had lost the CAT scan and she had come for nothing. She said they did not seem to have any sympathy when she told them she was anxious to know her diagnosis since her husband and son had both died of tumors. She said they would not give her any more information. So she said that she would not leave until the doctor called her daughter. She wouldn't budge. And when the doctor finally called her daughter, me, who spoke in perfect English, lo and behold, we had our assurances the CAT scan would be found, promises for a conference call, and apologies for any suffering my mother might have gone through. So basically she's saying there that when her mother is at the hospital trying to get the CAT scan, they're like basically, being jerks to her, like blowing her off, not really trying to help her. And I feel like this is something I've seen before in my life when, like, if someone has, like maybe a Chinese accent like Amy's Tan mother has, or a Spanish accent or anything like that, and, like, people working or whatever just, like, don't really want to help them, They just basically think it's okay to, like, give them, like, worse service. And I'm sympathetic to anybody working a shitty job like that, Like, I always have sympathy for workers. But that just doesn't seem right, Like, is it that they really couldn't understand her, or that they just don't feel like they should have to try to understand her, I always feel like when people say, like, oh, I can't understand what this person's saying, it's like, can you really not understand? And I think Amy Tan kind of touches on that when she says that, like, some of her friends would say that they couldn't understand anything her mother said, and then other friends would say they understood half of what she said, and then other friends would say they understood, like, most of it, like 90%. So she's kind of like, well, what's going on here? Is it just like the effort that people are putting in to try to understand? I don't know. But anyway, I think she kind of shows here the unfair treatment and the consequences that people can face if they speak in a dialect the way that her mother does when she doesn't get help with the CAT scan and all that kind of things. And she also goes on later on that same page, on page 130, she gets into how she thinks that being raised speaking a dialect at home made her like not do as well on standardized tests for English. And I might have talked about this, but I've tutored for the SAT before for English, and it is insane the way that they base it just on grammar, as if knowing where the comma goes means that you're a good writer or something like that. Obviously, I don't think that. But yeah, she basically says that that's another instance of unfair treatment based on standard English, right? The idea that if you speak some kind of dialect, well, you're stupid, you're unintelligent, you're unprofessional. What you have to say is less valuable than someone who speaks in standard English. So, but she does end on the positive note, right? She talks about how for some of the lines in her book, she felt like she was being too standardized with her English. Her English was too standard. Like she gives us this line that she says was originally in one of her stories. It says, "That was my mental quandary in its nascent state." And then the way Amy Tan's thinking about it now, she goes on to say, "This is a terrible line which I can barely pronounce." So I think a lot of this story is about her coming to realize how messed up it was that people used to treat her mother unfairly for speaking in a dialect, and how actually the dialect is a positive thing. It connects us to our culture. It makes us part of a community and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I think that's what I have on this essay. So if you wanted to write about something like this, again, this is a topic for our narrative essay. This is the culture and language topic. If you wanted to write about this, you would write about, I don't know, maybe some kind of different dialect or some kind of different English, like she says, that you use that either connects you to your culture or your family or your background or something like that, or that makes you part of just like a community in some way. Like I was thinking about this, like my niece, she's 14 years old. She's super into like anime and like manga stuff. And like there's some words that she'll use when talking about that I'm not really familiar with, and I have to like ask her to explain. Or like I've said before, talking about like sports. If I'm talking to people about sports, I have to be like, okay, do you know like a lot about sports or like just a little bit? Because that's going to change how I want to talk about it. And it's certain things that when you hear people talk in this kind of like dialect, in like the specific words associated with the community that you're like a part of, or like you recognize it, you're like, oh, you're someone who knows about video games, like we can talk in this kind of specialized language that only people part of this group would understand. So any example that you have about that, I think I kind of asked you for an example for the homework I gave you. But any story that you can tell of that happening, like for me, I could tell a story of a friend coming over and they say, marinara and ricotta, and my mom's like, "What's wrong with you? It's marina, ricotta." And then you could kind of use that as like a moment where you realize, like, wow, the fact that I talk this way kind of makes me part of a certain group, or the fact that I can talk this way connects me back to my culture, the generations that came before, maybe the country that your family may have, moved to America from, whatever it is. Even though for me, no one in my family lived in Italy for like generations at this point, but we still have those certain things, that mark you as part of that culture. So that's the culture and language topic. That's how we see it showing up, I think, in this mother tongue essay. And that's it for now. See you later.